Sunday night, my Sunday night best. And I think this is an episode of P's to me. The things that jumped out to me, pre-grieving, pieces of paper, and pregnancy. We didn't come back to that. I'm sure we will. Let's start with I'm just going to jump around because without Logan there, we've lost sort of like the T-Rex. Now we're having to talk about the smaller dinosaurs. And what we're seeing is that the narcissistic patterns we're running into are so much more subtle, and there's so many little twists and turns they're taking, right? So let's take it, let's break this down. Let's talk a little bit about the pre-grieving of Roman. I found that fascinating because I thought that was an extraordinarily great metaphor for what people from narcissistic families are going through all the time. They're always pre-grieving, right? One day this parent most likely will predecease them, and there's nothing but thousands and thousands and thousands of losses. It was very clear that the day would come. The father was getting older, but Roman's use of that phrase that I was pre-grieving, obviously as a way for Roman to deny and avoid his emotions, which is what he does. And it speaks to that sort of vulnerable narcissistic stuff that Roman has, but there's some big stuff on Roman that's emerging. I'll come back to him in a minute. But I loved that idea of pre-grieving because I think it captured a really, really interesting metaphor that happens for anybody who has a narcissistic parent, especially somebody who was as trauma bonded as Roman was. And it's interesting. Now what we're starting to see is a bit of the sniveling, right? Logan was just pure, unadulterated narcissism, dark tetrad through and through. The other people, the Carls and the Jerrys, they're all not, and Frank, they're not as good at this, right? They're definitely self-serving, but it really speaks to how Logan would do anything to anyone, but everyone else is kind of sniveling, whereas Logan would be like, hey, I'm going to do this. So that you're seeing the weaknesses, I don't say weaknesses, but maybe the less psychopathics of the people under Logan, but they still have that sort of very self-centered drive. It's also interesting to watch how much triangulation starts happening. When there was a common enemy who was alive, or a common enemy to align with, and that was Logan, when he was gone, this is where you sort of see this triangulated kind of sparring. And that's what you're seeing with sort of that B team, that senior management team of Frank and Carl and Jerry, all kind of starting to snipe at each other and kind of almost having a parallel conversation that we're going to start seeing the kids do. Tom just remains, we're starting to see what a sniveling, self-serving, kind of unctuous person. We've always known that about him. But again, with Logan, without the protection of Logan, his snivelingness looks more snivelly. And it's big narcissists protect small narcissists. Without that protection gone, Tom is like a really, really insecure turtle without a shell. This is a very small part of the story, but I think it's one worth mentioning because I think it brings up a really interesting narcissistic dynamic, which is Mattson. Now, Mattson, I don't even know what that whole story is with him. He's got that sort of like self-righteous meets communal, meets rigidly ordered, sort of odd guy, narcissistic person. And it was so interesting. It was one of those moments where you had sort of a premonition. I knew that if I didn't answer Mattson's call, he wouldn't take it back. So that was those power plays that the Mattsons of the world are always engaging in. And that was really disarming for them, as you could see. But that's the game a Mattson plays. There's a sort of a weird kind of a rigidity and an order, but it's all in the name of control. So that's that whole thing. Mattson is going to be our next kind of person to really keep an eye on. We're going to see a really interesting blend of narcissistic features in him. And Greg may actually now officially be the patron saint of social awkwardness. But now let's go to Connor. Connor, again, not being willing to let go of the father. What does he want to do? He wants to just buy the house and buy his father's house, his father, whom he wasn't very tied to, but then wanting to sort of occupy the next and wanting to occupy the nest. And then him giving Marcia her price, and Marcia, again, not feeling that kind of trauma bonded connection. She's like, peace, if I can get that much money without paying a realtor's commission, good for me. But let's go back to Marcia, because can we just say Marcia, damn. Woo! I mean, listen, hell hath no fury and all of that, but Marcia plays hardball. Marcia plays hardball. I was never a Carrie fan, so sort of sniveling Carrie didn't really bother me, and he's gonna marry me and all that sadness, but Marcia don't play. And I think in that strange way, she was a very good match for Logan. She had that same kind of steely dark-heartedness. So I think that the Marcia character is sort of interesting to watch. She sure as hell wouldn't want her as my stepmother, but Carrie was bothering me. We had to bring her down a few rungs, but I was like, "Ooh, damn, Marcia," basically. Um, Couple of things that came up with Kendall. Kendall is now the resolve, the resolve Kendall had, because now let's go to that other pieces of paper. Okay. So the piece of paper was such a great metaphor for a narcissistic family. They have the piece of paper. They you can see that they're sort of kind of quibbling over it. What does this mean? Was he underlying that Kendall should be the take the line of succession, become the CEO? Or was he crossing that thought out? At the very end of the episode, we see that it was so ambiguous that that the line was both crossing out and underlining. So we don't know what it means. And if ever there was a greater metaphor for a narcissistic parent, I can't think of it. You never know where you stand. Kendall never knew where he stood with his father. And that line is something, honestly, I think he'll probably look at that screenshot for the rest of his life. But it gave Kendall that thing he always needed from his father, to be seen. And so at some point in time, we don't know the date of it, but at some point in time, Kendall was so seen by his father, it went down on a piece of paper. But again, you see that even in death, the legacy a narcissistic parent leaves, and that what Kendall says, he made me hate him and then he died. I've got my notes on my phone. I feel like he didn't like me. I disappointed him. Even when a narcissistic parent is alive, that's the mantra of their adult children, of their child children. That's just what they leave. I've disappointed them. They don't like me. And that's a ghost that is going to haunt Kendall, even as he tries to occupy his father's shoes. But let's just jump down to the end on this one. You always wondered, could Kendall do it? Well, I guess we're starting to see Kendall can do it. And he was willing to play, who was willing to do the kind of, the subterfuge, if you will, the kind of backstab that he needed to do, and he's going to go after his father in death. Now, one thing that would be interesting to note is making it sound like Logan was already sort of starting to lose his marbles, and now his more competent sons are stepping in, will be good for the stock price. So it is good for the company, but Kendall's getting a 2 for the price of 1 on this one. Not only is he getting to stick it to his father, which he needs to do to feel whole, he also gets the up on the stock price. But in a small way, he's also betraying Roman. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I'm probably going to end on that because it's so enlightening. But with Kendall, what he's also showing is the willingness to play as dirty a game as his father would. It's good business. One would argue it was good business. And every one of the horrible, horrible things that Logan did were often good business. And so Kendall may be a better heir apparent and closer to dad than we thought. Maybe dad had an eye for that. But I think that the less trauma bonded place that Kendall sits in, that is coming out in his willingness to play Logan's game the way Logan would have. Again, makes you think that the old man kind of had an eye for something. Taking this position is going to make Kendall completely lose the plot. But for now, Kendall is leaning into it and then sort of putting out that menace, against the PR guy who, Hugo. Now, what is also very interesting is the fragility of that alliance between the siblings. I mean, I think that we all have our moments, right? Like, oh my gosh, the siblings are getting together. At least that's the psychologist to me. Like, oh, they do need each other. But you could see that as soon as that bone was thrown in the middle of the pack, that Kendall was named on a piece of paper, Kendall turned right away, because they're all three of them, Shiv and Roman and Kendall, they're always going to choose the thing that is good for them. They're not going to always choose for the greater good. And even though it seems like we're going to stick together, we're going to stick together. For Kendall, this is him really finally kind of getting what he believed was his after all that time. And I think that that's, that again, that fragile, how fragile that alliance was between them, that in a way, what's happening is dad is still pulling the strings from beyond the grave. It's as though you're not going to have your little alliance, that dad was going to keep mucking up the works. That's something that was always there for them since they were little kids, to not be able to sort of settle into that safe space with each other. It's fascinating to watch Shiv say that, when she's talking about everyone who's sort of like being kind of mercenary, Carrie and Marcia and all the people involved in the business. And she says, I'm the only one who lost something that they wanted, which I found fascinating. And obviously she's not telling Tom about the pregnant pause, that she's pregnant. And, and I think that that's a surprise to anyone. And by the way, carrying that pregnancy really well. And so I think that, we now see that Shiv had a vision and may very well have had in her mind that if she's producing this child, that whether the father would see this as an heir apparent, maybe, maybe not, but somehow might cement her status. That doesn't get to be. And Shiv may also have had those trauma bonded dreams that her father would actually be interested in her child, in his grandchild. Let's talk a little bit about Roman, though. I was very anti-Roman for a long time. And now what we're seeing some really interesting cracks in Roman. I think they've been happening all along. For all of Roman's potty-mouthed rants and digs and sexual proclivities, there is a strange empathy that courses through him that you don't see in anyone else in that system, and a strange sort of loyalty. It came out a couple of times, like it's sort of that when he started sort of seeing the coldness and cruelty, how literally transactional all of these folks were. You see this kind of wince that comes through Roman's face, like, that's not right. It really came out markedly with the Carrie thing when he noticed Marcia telling Carrie, you are not going to be here, lady, and you're not going upstairs. Your stuff's in a bag. Get the hell out of here. And you're going out the back entrance. In a way, all of these things are reminding Roman sort of what he comes from over and over and over again. It comes out again when the two publicists, after the decision is made that both Kendall and Roman will run the company, and they go and have the private meeting with Hugo and Carolina. And, Carolina and Hugo both suggest like, hey, listen, we could really put a story out there that he was losing it and you guys are stepping in. And Roman was very against that. Not just that trauma bondedness with Logan, which I think played a role, but there's an interesting kind of a loyalty to Roman we see emerge here, which is why it was so hard for him, for example, to fire Jerry. And it's so hidden under so many layers of mud and muck that I can't believe that I'm saying that maybe Roman might be the slightly most human of all. I always knew that Shiv was the one most like her father. Kendall showing some chops, but Roman, through all of that really combative exterior, is actually the one who's saying, is this really what I'm from? And almost trying to keep it together, but he could never show that vulnerability in that system. So you always hear those constant insults coming out of his mouth all of the time. The other thing we saw with Kendall, which I found very, very interesting, was Kendall again showing a few of his more narcissistic and chops, in that he was able to sort of with Stewie, where he started crying and it felt like a real moment between friends, but he really was trying to get Stewie to fight for him and really playing on his sympathies. Hey, it's the day after my dad died. Wouldn't one of my oldest friends want me to be CEO? But that was after what seemed like a real moment of grief. That lability, that switch between emotion, is very much what we see in these kinds of personality styles like narcissism. That was not lost on me. Willa, of course, is feeling nothing, but already stepping into a new space. Got to tip your hat to her chameleonness. And in some ways, what Carrie was trying to pull off, Willa actually did. But I think more than anything, what we really learn in this episode is about narcissistic family legacies, and that these triangulated messes are often passed on generation to generation. Old wounds, old hurts, all of that he is still, again, it can feel like these parents, through any number of ways. In some families you might see it's how they constructed a will or a family trust. In another family, it might be some bizarre letter they've left behind. In this family, it's this massive multi-billion-dollar company. But more than anything, that he drops this little thing in the middle with this Kendall thing, whether that was intentional or not, he's created this sort of triangulated space, which we always knew that he would. We can tell you right now, Kendall and Roman doing this is not going to work because they're coming at it in almost very different ways. In a strange way, it seems that Roman is trying to protect his father's legacy. He wants to grow it, but he feels feels like there's an allegiance there, and Kendall doesn't have any of that. That's where we're going to start seeing sparks fly, and anyone want to take a bet on how soon it is before they betray sort of Shiv. So listen, Kendall's showing his stripes, maybe more like dad than we thought. Maybe really did learn at the old man's knee. Shiv's pregnancy is going to be a real interesting storyline, and Roman. You know what? This is why narcissism's tricky. Narcissistic people are not devoid of empathy. They do have certain things that pull at their heartstrings. And when you see that happen, you can see how confusing it'll be. Again, I'm just every week I'm blown away, and I can't believe we only get 6 more weeks of it, but I'll be there every Sunday night wherever I am. So thanks again, and love to hear your thoughts too. Bye.